Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Medieval, Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I'm your host for this podcast. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you and give you an idea of what we're going to cover in these podcast episodes. I am an academic medievalist. Specifically, my area of specialty is 13th and 14th century European literature that looks back to the Viking Age and the Old English pre-Conquest era. I work in Old English, Old Norse, Old Irish, Middle Welsh, Middle Irish, some Latin, French, and a variety of other cultural aspects of medieval studies. Literature, law, medicine, and the intersections of gender and sexuality on medieval literary culture. Now, as an academic medievalist, my interest is imparting my knowledge of the Middle Ages to you. I also hope to get the knowledge of my colleagues and friends in medieval studies, a variety of amazing scholars who do everything from art, archaeology, music, and theater, to share their expertise with you. But I want to have a little bit of fun with this. When I do public lectures, I much prefer to kind of answer the questions that you all have about medieval studies and about medieval society. One of the things that I found in my 25 years as a medievalist is that most people have misconceptions about the Middle Ages that come from popular culture. Now, popular culture, of course, is a great introduction to medieval studies. Things like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or even D&D. These are all medievalisms. Now, a medievalism is a modern or post-medieval impression of what it means to be medieval. And medievalisms are a great way to start your interest in medieval studies. There are a lot of really good films and TV series and other popular culture avenues for exploring medievalisms. But the Middle Ages is a different thing. So first of all, when I talk about the Middle Ages, you guys are probably wondering, well, what exactly does she mean? The Middle Ages, which is kind of an artificial chronological designation, the Middle Ages covers from about 476 of the Common Era, that's CE, all the way up to 1453, give or take, because it all depends on who you ask. Now, 476 is the fall of Rome. And so for Western Europe, that is an apt starting point. But of course, Western Europe is not the only place in the Middle Ages. Western Europe is our source for an awful lot of our texts, our maps, our histories, our chronicles. But there were other vibrant medieval societies all over the world in this period of time. So if we consider the 1,000 years from 476 until 1453, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, that's 1,000 years of history. Now, one of the first things I want to kind of dispel, and I apologize if at any point in this time during this podcast, if I step on your expectations or crush your little hearts about what you think you know about the Middle Ages, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. We all grow up with modern misconceptions. We all bring our own background, our own prejudices, our own baggage to the way we look at the past. So if you think you know something and you are definitively certain that that is the fact, if I challenge it, I'm sorry. But that's kind of the point of the podcast. Because understanding the past, understanding how we got to where we are today is probably one of the best ways of making sure that we don't keep repeating the cycles of violence and intolerance and prejudice that have perpetuated for centuries. So, ideally, in this podcast, when we talk about the Middle Ages, when we talk about the medieval world, I'm going to challenge what you think you know. And I, of course, will say straight up, I don't know everything. And if there's something I don't know, I will find out. A long time ago, I was a journalist. I worked for national Sunday papers in Ireland, where I did my PhD at Trinity College, Dublin. I worked for a daily paper in Tallahassee when I was an undergraduate at Florida State. And I understand the importance of accuracy. I understand the importance of getting to an audience the correct information. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that everything I say is accurate, to make sure that I have the facts and the information necessary to give you the best possible view of the Middle Ages. There's an awful lot I don't cover. I cover a lot. I'm a scholar with a wide range of interests. But that's why I want to introduce you to a variety of other scholars who know more than I do. So during this podcast, I'm going to be introducing new ideas where I may not have all the answers, but I'm going to look for them. And I want you to join me as I look for those answers and as I start this adventure. Now, you might say, why a podcast? I've done a variety of other public lectures. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you can always catch me at a Profs and Pints in D.C., Baltimore, or Annapolis. I'm also on the History Channel, on the series Dark Marvels and the series The Unbelievable, hosted by Dan Aykroyd. Fortunately, I never get to meet Dan Aykroyd. But those are a wonderful way for me to find out new things and share that information with all of you. But I decided that a podcast was the best way for me to shape the information and also make sure that you all have a chance to meet other scholars who do really fantastically interesting stuff. So, when we talk about the Middle Ages, that 1,000-year period, the first thing you have to understand is that a lot of you have probably heard the phrase, the Dark Ages. Dun, 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 the Dark Ages. And some of you are probably sitting there going, oh yeah, no, Dark Ages, Dark Ages. Well, what does Dark Ages mean to you? It implies grim and violent. If you watch the 1981 film Excalibur, it starts with the Dark Ages and this swelling, amazing chorus of Wagner. And a bunch of people lit only by fire in 15th century style armor. Anachronistic. An anachronism is when you take something that is out of time and set it in the past. Excalibur is a wonderful popular culture foray into the Arthurian legend in so many ways. But the Dark Ages, the image of that violence and brutality and that really uncomfortable sex scene with Gabriel Byrne in full plate armor having sex with the actress who plays Igraine, is incorrect. There is no such thing as the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages is a term that was coined by scholars who were looking at that period of time in the Middle Ages where they see darkness. And when I say they see darkness, I mean they see no culture, no light, very few written texts. And the thing is, there were plenty of written texts. If we consider the beginning of the Middle Ages as the 5th century, there are illuminated manuscripts written at Christian monastic centers all over Europe. There is art. There are goldsmiths and shipwrights who make beautiful, beautiful artifacts, many of which we find in the archaeological digs now. So when people say the Dark Ages, they want to imply that somehow there was a period of time where there isn't culture, where there isn't enlightenment. That isn't correct. So when we talk about the 5th century and the early Middle Ages, we're talking about a time where there is art and literature and culture, where there's all kinds of exploration and contact happening between different peoples. Now, again, 476 to 1453, that's 1,000 years. And in fact, the end of the Middle Ages, 1453, is the classical definition of the end of the Middle Ages because of the fall of Constantinople, which was the capital of Eastern Christendom. And when it falls to the Ottoman Turks, there is a sense that somehow a curtain falls on this period of the Middle Ages. Well, that isn't true either. In fact, if you are an English historian, you might date the end of the Middle Ages to 1485, which is the final battle in the Wars of the Roses, where Richard III was killed on the field of Bosworth in August 22nd, 1485. You might even go so far as 1509 if you're an English historian. You might decide that the date when Henry VIII takes the English throne marks the end of the Middle Ages. Now, of course, if you're an Italian scholar, you're looking at medieval or even Renaissance as the early 14th century. Now, the term Renaissance, which means rebirth, is a phrase that gets tacked on to different periods of time in European history. And it largely got tacked on by later people. One of the things you have to keep in mind about these chronological designations is that somebody decided to apply them. Now, even the term Middle Ages, Petrarch decided that there needed to be a name for that 1,000-year period from the fall of Rome to him. Now, Petrarch is writing in the 14th century. He is writing a generation or two after Dante Alighieri. And so his view of what is Renaissance, what is medieval, is based on his own sense of Italian culture and advancement in his lifetime. So it is individuals contemporary with the Middle Ages who decided, well, we're not really dark, we're not really advanced, or we are more advanced. So they said, from the fall of Rome to me is the Middle Ages. And that's where we get that term. In fact, the word medieval, which is the adjective to describe this period, comes from the Latin medium aevum, which simply means Middle Ages. Please don't call it medieval times, as I tell my students, because medieval times is a restaurant. But the medieval period covers all kinds of language and thought and theology and innovation. It is certainly not a dark period. Now, there are certainly dark aspects of the Middle Ages. And of course, my particular area of specialty is torture and brutality. That's always good to say at cocktail parties. People say, what do you do? Torture and brutality and judicial punishment. Yes, actually, that is my area of specialty. In fact, you can find most of my books available up on Amazon. And I bring that up because when I work on torture and brutality, and when I say that, people are like, oh, of course, violence was everywhere in the Middle Ages. People were beheading each other left, right, and center. There were bodies hanging from gallows, from gibbets. They were in cages, crows pecking out their eyes. Yes, that happened. But it wasn't everywhere. It wasn't all the time. And it wasn't nearly the constant visual that most medieval people had. So when we talk about medieval, we talk about something that's dark and the Dark Ages, we have to understand that in some ways we're projecting our own prejudices back onto this historic period. In fact, many of the scholars who came up with the idea of the Middle Ages, working in the 19th century, discovering texts that had lain unread for centuries because the languages had fallen out of use. Many of those scholars were looking for information to reinforce their own worldview. And for a lot of 19th century European scholars, that worldview was white, patriarchal, and Christian. So the information that they found, they used to serve a narrative that medieval Europe was largely white, patriarchal, and Christian. And while those things are partly true, they are not the sum total of the Middle Ages. As I said earlier, there were civilizations all over the world. During this 1,000-year period, if we're going to use 476 to 1453, we're going to use that designation for medieval, there are civilizations in Ethiopia, in North Africa, in India, in Japan, in China. There are sophisticated, complex societies with fully functioning legal systems and societal morals and values. In many ways, those societal morals and values are not unlike those of medieval Western Christianity. But in a lot of ways, the modern scholars never got that far. So when we talk about a lot of the scholarship, it comes from the basis of 19th century European and American scholars who were trying to validate their own worldview. And if you know anything about the 19th century, that was a period of empire, of expansion and conquest. The sun never set on the British Empire by 1901, where England, tiny little England, had taken over a vast empire, a vast global empire, conquering sometimes through diplomacy, but also sometimes through violence and subjugation. And so that history of imperialism in Western Europe as it reached out to other parts of the world was validated by scholars who looked back at the medieval past that they found, that they wanted to, and they created this narrative of a white, Christian, European Middle Ages. Now, I say that not to diminish where we've come in medieval studies, but to acknowledge our origins. It's important to do that. As a medievalist in the last 10 years, it has been necessary for me to grapple with my own biases, my own prejudices when it comes to medieval studies. I started studying the Middle Ages as an undergraduate at Florida State 30 years ago. I went as a foreign student to Ireland to finish out my last year, so I went to Trinity College, Dublin. And I learned an awful lot of languages and an awful lot about cultural aspects of the Middle Ages that were completely new to me. But over the last 30 years of my career, and 25 since I got my PhD, I have learned that not everything I thought was true is actually true. So that's another purpose of this podcast. That's another reason I want to do this podcast, is so that you can understand that sometimes our knowledge is shaped as much by our context as it is by the historical facts. So some of the first scholars working on medieval texts really didn't actually know what they were looking at to begin with. In fact, the Beowulf manuscript, and we will certainly have an episode that deals with Beowulf. Beowulf is one of my all-time favorite texts. It's one of the first texts I read in translation. In fact, I read a version of it when I was a child. I was that kind of a geek. Beowulf is a text that is steeped in all kinds of contextual history. And of course, the date of the poem itself, the date of its composition, before it was finally written down, a lot of that is a matter of scholarly debate. So when you look at the scholarship of something like that, you have to understand that it's a constantly shifting thing. And you might say, oh, it was written 1,000 years ago. Yes, but that doesn't mean that our understanding of it is stagnant. So as a medieval scholar, part of what we have to do is interrogate what we think about the information that we have and be receptive to new information. And several of the scholars that I plan to talk to are people on the cutting edge of that new information. digital humanities, looking at issues of race and global identity in the Middle Ages, looking at questions of gender and sexuality. Because I got news for you. A lot of modern people like to look back at the past and justify their own modern prejudices, but they would be wrong to do that. Because in the Middle Ages, sure, there is violence and bigotry, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic feeling. Sure, there's sexism and a certain amount of condemnation of sexuality that is not, shall we say, according to Christian norms. But that isn't everybody in the Middle Ages. And it isn't universal. And in fact, things like sex, well, if anybody tells you there's no sex in medieval literature, they've never read any. So we will definitely cover that. But when we talk about the development of the Middle Ages as a discipline, we have to understand that technology has given us new insights into things we thought we knew. If you look at the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, and of course, if you're interested in Tolkien and his medieval sources, I actually teach a course on that for medievalists.net, which is available to the public. You can sign up for that class, and we will certainly have at least one podcast episode that deals with Tolkien and his sources, but also Tolkien and his medievalism. But if you look at his work, as a medievalist, as an academic medievalist, he was writing 100 years ago. He died in 1975, the year after I was born. So his work is foundational in a lot of ways, but we've also learned an awful lot since then. So I am constantly learning as a scholar. I'm a literary historian. I recognize that I don't have all of the tools available to archaeologists, digital humanists, that I don't have every resource at my fingertips. I don't do all the languages. I don't do all the cultures and all of the societies that existed at the time. So I will hope to bring you people who do, so that we can have engaging discussions and conversations about these very things. It's also going to intersect with modern politics, and there's just no way around that. Because so much of what we do in modern society, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Europe, or even Africa, India, or Asia, is shaped by our historical past. And as I said earlier, the more we understand that historical past, the better placed we are to understand our present and to change our future. So, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. So, the Middle Ages, as defined by 19th century scholars, is that 1,000-year period, but it's also a period where they could see reflections of themselves. And they saw those reflections and in many cases produced their own interpretations and impressions of it. That's where you get the amazing medievalisms, like the pre-Raphaelite painters, like the poets, like the novelist Ivanhoe, which that novel by Sir Walter Scott is very, very long, and there's an awful lot wrong with it, especially in the way that it casts the Middle Ages. But it was an important touchstone for a lot of later scholars and artists who said, that's the Middle Ages. The thing is, it wasn't the Middle Ages. It is a medievalism. It is Sir Walter Scott's interpretation of the medieval, but he's working off of literature and legend. Now, other 19th century scholars were working in languages. And back to Beowulf, that manuscript was discovered in 1815. And when I say discovered, it was more rediscovered because it was sitting in a shelf, in a drawer on a shelf in the British Museum. And it had nearly been destroyed when the original British Library, which belonged to a man whose surname was Cotton, the Cotton Library was a huge collection of medieval manuscripts. Cotton decided in the 17th century that manuscripts in Old English and Middle English and Latin needed to be collected and preserved. So he bought as many as he could. He found them wherever he could with the intent of preserving them and saving them to make sure that they didn't disappear, that they didn't get destroyed, because people did destroy manuscripts. My friend and colleague, Thea Tomani, was doing research in Worcester Cathedral in England in the library, looking for the burial records of King John. Yes, that King John. He wasn't a particularly good king. We'll talk about him on another episode. But she was doing research on his burial, and she was looking for those records. And the librarian of the cathedral library said, "I'm so sorry. We don't have those 13th century records because at some point in the 16th century, schoolboys used them to make drumheads and kites." Drumheads and kites. Because, of course, many medieval manuscripts, in fact, most of them, are written on vellum, which is animal skin that has been scraped and treated. And, of course, what is used for drumheads? Animal skin. So for a 16th century schoolboy, think probably 10 years old, 12 years old, these 13th century manuscripts that nobody can read make excellent drumheads. That is every medieval literary historian's nightmare, because now we don't have those records. Other records have been lost through fire, through war. During the Irish War for Independence in 1919 to 1921, the British bombed four courts. They bombed the archives, the customs house. Thousands of medieval manuscripts were destroyed in that war for independence. And then more were destroyed again in the Irish Civil War that followed. World War II, during the Allied bombings of Europe, of Germany, libraries were destroyed, cathedrals were destroyed. When the Germans bombed England during the Blitz and destroyed Coventry, libraries were destroyed. Cathedrals were destroyed, in addition to the thousands of lives that were lost. Anytime there is political, military upheaval that results in violence and war, we not only lose bits of our humanity, we lose parts of our past. So it's necessary to understand what we have and why we have only that. The Beowulf manuscript was one of those manuscripts that was collected by Cotton in his library. And he had massive filing cabinets that were designated by the head of a Roman empire. The Roman emperor's head was a bust in marble at the end of the column. And then there were individual columns, and then there were drawers. So if you had Vitellius, that's your emperor. A is the first column, and drawer number 14, count all the way down, you open that drawer, and that's where you'll find the requisite manuscript. Now, Cotton's library was full of stuff he couldn't read. It was full of stuff that nobody really could read. They could pick through and figure it out. So when they cataloged it, they wrote down what they thought was in each manuscript. When that library burned down in 1731, we have no idea what we lost. The Beowulf manuscript was almost lost. It was damaged. The Sir Gawain and the Green Knight manuscript that also has pearl, cleanliness, and patience, an alliterative 14th century collection of Middle English romances. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is another one of my absolute favorite poems, and we will certainly have at least one episode that talks about that. That manuscript was almost lost as well. And in many respects, we have no idea what we lost. Because a lot of scholars, when you look at a manuscript and you're cataloging it, you flip through it, you write down what you think is in it, and you don't read the whole thing. The Beowulf manuscript doesn't just have Beowulf in it. The Beowulf manuscript has an Old English version of Judith, the story of the Jewish heroine who slew Holofernes by decapitating him when he was drunk, when he had tried to rape her. She is a heroine in every sense of the word. And her story in Old English captures that sense of heroism. The manuscript also contains an Old English version of the Wonders of the East, which is based off of natural histories like Pliny and the Greek texts that talk about all the fantastic and marvelous peoples all over the world. The people who cataloged that manuscript said, Beowulf, because the first word that's on there at the top of the text is not actually Beowulf. The poem itself starts, What wegardena in jardagum theod kuningum thasje fremen. And a later editor decided to call it Beowulf because that's the guy that the poem is actually about. So an awful lot of our record keeping, an awful lot of our cataloging is a little haphazard. Scholars all over the world work tirelessly to try and sort some of that mess out. So we're going to try and pull on some of those threads during the course of this podcast as well. Paleography is one of my areas of expertise, reading medieval manuscripts, reading the handwriting of medieval manuscripts, which can be treasure troves of everything from marginalia, rabbits that kill. There are all those famous images. I'm sure you've all seen the memes on Facebook and social media of rabbits that hunt men down and flay them. Well, in fairness, the rabbits are simply doing to men what men do to them. Or bizarre manuscripts with flying penis monsters. That's a personal favorite of mine, is the flying penis monster in Gratian's Decretals from the 11th century. There are also texts that have marginalia, penis trees, people copulating, people getting up to all kinds of things in the margins. In some cases, scholars who've been reading a medieval manuscript, this is scholars in the Middle Ages, are bored and they start to write things in the margins. The marginalia can tell us all kinds of things about the reality of medieval life. So as much of a debt as we owe to those scholars of the 19th century who decided to start looking at manuscripts, who started looking at the medieval past with an eye to shaping their own present, we have to also understand that they had their own perspective and they were projecting it on the Middle Ages as much as we project ours onto the 19th century and onto the Middle Ages as well. So we have to take into consideration new information as we find out new things. The scholarship from 30 years ago is not the same as the scholarship now. There are young scholars working across disciplines in the Middle Ages and trying to create a different understanding of that medieval past. So ideally, my goal for this podcast is to share that with you, to share as much information, as many interesting things as I can with you. Now, we're going to talk about violence and brutality. We will talk about the uncomfortable aspects of the Middle Ages. We will talk about racism. We will talk about violence and sexism and atrocity, because you have to. You have to talk about these things to understand them. But we will also talk about beauty and art and love. We will talk about literature and music. And we will talk about faith and devotion. And ideally, we're going to dispel some of the modern misconceptions that have developed around the Middle Ages. Now, when we talk about faith and devotion in the Middle Ages, it is predominantly Christian when we talk about Western Europe. But there were thousands of people who did not practice Christianity. There were vibrant Jewish communities, vibrant Muslim communities. In fact, we in Western Europe owe a huge debt to the Muslim scholars who preserved medical knowledge, physiological knowledge. Most of the medical texts that come up through Europe come through Muslim Spain, because the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule from 777 until 1477 with the Reconquista. And of course, when we get up into the 15th century, and when we talk about things like the Reconquista, we will, of course, talk about the Spanish Inquisition, which nobody expects. Well, actually, everybody expects it. I mean, really, if we're going to talk about medieval mischief and mayhem, we've got to talk about the Spanish Inquisition. But we will also be talking about the reality of the Spanish Inquisition, the reality of inquisitorial courts. We're going to talk about the reality of marriage laws and the reality of societal expectations for women, for men, and for those people who fell in between. Because sexuality and gender fluidity and even trans identity has always existed. It is not simply the imposition of modern ideas onto the past to discuss the reality of sexuality and gender identity, or even to discuss societies that were more tolerant and societies that were less tolerant. In addition to talking about things like the Inquisition and the inquisitorial courts, and as I said, the Spanish Inquisition, we're also going to talk about religions that existed that were not Christian, that were not Jewish, that were not Muslim. In fact, there's an entire medieval tradition of religions that develop out of other religious traditions. It's a process called syncretism, where different religious ideas meld together, kind of assimilate and fashion something new. And a lot of medieval Christianity was actually influenced by pre-existing non-Christian ideas, or in some cases, Christian thought was influenced by Jewish thought and Muslim thought. And of course, the people of the book, as they're called, that would be the Jewish people, the Muslim people, and Christians, who all share an original text, which is the Torah and the Talmud, so taken together, the Tanakh. Those people took ideas from each other. And in a lot of cases, there was a lot more cooperation between these different religious groups than a lot of modern audiences think. In fact, Iberian Spain, when it was under Muslim rule, there were Jewish communities, Christian communities, and Muslim communities living side by side in relative peace. Now, I say relative peace, and that's an important distinction. I'm not trying to claim that the Middle Ages was a panacea of love, harmony, and light. It was not. No more so than the modern world. There is brutality. There is viciousness. There are people who abused their power. There is tyranny. There is violence against women. There is violence against marginalized communities. There is bigotry. There is hatred. But it isn't universal, and it isn't everybody. And when we look at literature, when we look at law, when we look at history, and we look at art and music and archaeology, one of the things that becomes apparent is that medieval people everywhere, and I do mean everywhere, had a lot of shared ideas, had a lot of shared values. Just as much as William the Conqueror, William the Bastard, as he's also called, just as much as he had to atone for the bloodshed of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, so too did the Japanese warrior elite feel the need to atone for bloodshed in military endeavors. In fact, the Hojoi, that Japanese rite of atonement, is still practiced today. In some cases, other societies carry out traditions that start in the Middle Ages and keep them current. We do that too. Western Europe and in America, we have traditions, we have holidays and celebrations, and ideas that actually go all the way back to the early Middle Ages. So we have an awful lot to learn from medieval people, an awful lot to learn from the broad scope of the global Middle Ages. There's a lot of mischief, there's certainly a lot of mayhem, and I'm hoping that over the course of this podcast, that you will gain a greater understanding of what that means. I am looking forward to sharing this adventure with you, and I hope that you will catch the next episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.